Early reforms in the industrial age. Well, if we're going to talk about reform, we should talk about what needed changed. And one of the prevailing notions of the late 1800s is what we've come to call social Darwinism. This comes from a corruption of Charles Darwin's ideas on evolution. Herbert Spencer, an English philosopher, attempted to apply Darwin's ideas of natural selection to human society, basically arguing that the reason the rich are rich is because they have the talents and abilities and innate skills that allow them to be successful. The same way a species who thrives has the survival abilities to thrive in that environment. It doesn't hold up under good scrutiny. Nonetheless, these ideas of social Darwinism, this defense of the huge gap between the rich and the poor, saying that the rich are better people, essentially. This idea is accepted in the United States. And really, that intellectual movement is led by that guy there on the right, William Graham Sumner, who argued that government action for the poor was a waste. It was unnatural. It went against the laws of nature for government to step in and do anything to maybe address that gap between the rich and the poor, to offer a helping hand down to people who were struggling. This idea is challenged by reformers of the late 1800s. And there weren't as many as we'll get in the progressive era, which is more around the turn of the century. We'll talk about them in Unit 7. But these early reformers, that movement, the reform movement, is kind of kickstarted by this man, author Henry George, in his book, Progress and Poverty. He wrote that in 1879, and in the book, he argued that the United States economy was booming. Nobody would disagree with that. And in a situation like that, poverty should be on the decline. In fact, business was doing so well, poverty should all but disappear very soon for the United States. Nonetheless, George used statistical data to point out how the gap between the rich and the poor was actually growing. In this time of great prosperity, the gap between the rich and the poor is growing. The gains are not being shared by all. This is part of the reason why the era gets the name the Gilded Age. His book and the problems that he illuminates with that book inspired others to work to fix the problem. Some were lawyers like Clarence Darrow, a lawyer who really is going to do a lot of writing and really make the argument that poverty is a direct cause of crime. Criminals are not innately bad people. More crime is a result of people living in poverty and forced to make those tough, illegal decisions. Some of the reformers were economists, like this man, Richard Elley, who argues very strongly that economists should not be supporting theories that only help the rich. He points out that the laissez-faire economic policy that most economists supported at the time should not be an excuse to let people starve. Government should not be so hands-off with the economy that Americans are suffering in the ways that some are during the Gilded Age. He creates the American Economic Association, and what their organization is going to do is link economics to the social problems of the day and really urge government economic intervention, that the government should be doing more in the American economy, not so laissez-faire. Another economist who I don't have a picture of, Thorsten Veblen, who wrote The Theory of the Leisure Class, where he really attacks laissez-faire policy as just an excuse to be greedy. Edward Bellamy, not a economist by trade, an author by trade, criticizes the laissez-faire policies of the day, as many writers have done with a science fiction type novel, Looking Backward, written in 1887. This book got so popular, there were 10,000 copies sold every week. In this book, he uses the kind of parable of a man falling asleep and waking up in the future to propose ownership of the means of production by the workers owning the factories, the workers owning the railroads, the workers owning the steel mills and the mines, and those profits that those businesses generate would be shared equally among society, among the workers. He's proposing a socialist economy, okay? He's not the first person to do so, but this is a very accessible way to do so in this novel that's very popular among a lot of American readers. He's talking about not the competition of business, but economic cooperation of Americans. By 1890, only 3 years after the book comes out, there are clubs in 27 states calling for Bellamy's changes. In other words, you have 27 active socialist groups in America pushing very strongly for this kind of dramatic economic change. Some of the reformers of the era were also religious figures of the era. The old religious idea said that you have an obligation, you should work, you should spend your life working to save your soul and maybe saving other souls for a better afterlife. You don't want to go to the bad place, okay? Don't worry as much about life on earth. Lead a good life and do what you need to do to get your soul eternal salvation. The old idea was also that poverty was a result of sin. There was not a lot of Christian philosophers talking about God believing in equality here on earth. Perhaps equality in the afterlife, but not equality here on earth. If people are in poverty, it's a result of them making bad choices and living in sin. The new idea, the reform of that, the challenging idea is what we call the social gospel. And you're going to read more about it in a later assignment. The social gospel calls for improving the living conditions of your fellow man and saving their souls. In other words, help people out here on earth and try to get their life eternal salvation. As a result, we see church members really uniting to help others in society, especially in their immediate community. It's at this time, and as a result of the social gospel movement, that many churches really become the community centers that they are today. It's at this time that we see a lot more churches, especially Protestant churches, okay? Catholic churches might have been operating missions or supporting missions before this, but a lot more Protestant faith churches become the food pantry for their town or neighborhood. They become the place where the Boy Scouts meet on a weekly basis. Later, we're going to see churches used as places that groups like Alcoholics Anonymous can meet for a reasonable priced meeting space. So this idea of the social gospel, help people while they're here on earth, is expanded on by Christian theologian and philosopher Washington Gladden, who wrote Applied Christianity in 1886, and really takes a Christian perspective on some of the economic issues that we've just been talking about. He argues that competition is bad and that workers and owners should be working together and that everyone should be helping the poor. We also see more missionaries set up in urban areas of the country. And missionaries begin working in more of those urban areas. As cities grow, perhaps maybe the existing church systems were not enough to support all the people as those cities boom in the end of the 1800s. So places like Boston and New York City saw some important missionaries, listed over there on the right, do work within those cities. Alexander Irvine, those first two guys were Christian missionaries. Alexander Irvine was a Jewish missionary who worked in New York City. Another form of reform of the late 1800s and the Gilded Age, and one that I really enjoy looking into, is the settlement house movement. Settlement houses were buildings in poor neighborhoods in cities where the reformers that worked in those buildings, the people who ran the soup kitchen and the free kindergarten and the free daycare and the recreation center and the adult education classes, those reformers lived in that building full time. So downstairs in the main floor would be the daycare center, and upstairs would be the bed and the living quarters for everybody who worked out of that settlement house. The first of these is created in Chicago by Jane Addams. Jane Addams went over to England. She studied in England, and she volunteered at a settlement house in England. This movement actually started in England with reformers who didn't want to take a trolley down to the poor side of town in the morning, help out, and then go home to their nice ritzy house looking like the ones in Mary Poppins. They wanted to really know and understand the problems of the people that they were helping. It also helps them gain a voice in local government, because now
when they speak up at a city government meeting and talk about the problems in the 19th Ward, they're not just talking about it as interlopers who come in for a few hours a week. They're talking about it as residents. They know about the trash problems in the streets because they live through it. They know about the crime. They know about the smog because these are problems they experience firsthand as well. As we said, settlement houses offered a lot of services: childcare, kindergarten, soup kitchens, recreation centers, adult education. They also, in those education classes, we can see some efforts to Americanize the often immigrant poor. So English-speaking classes, cooking classes with a focus on traditional American ingredients and not ethnic immigrant ingredients. They also become centers for research on urban problems, and settlement houses disproportionately employ many women who are involved in a variety of reform efforts. One final note: if you ever go to Chicago, I encourage you to visit the Hull House Museum. It's a wonderful little museum near the University of Chicago's campus. Let's wrap up by briefly talking about the Panic of 1893, what today we would call an economic depression of 1893. This is the worst economic depression ever in U.S. history until 1929. Until we get to the Great Depression, the Panic of 1893 is the worst the economy has ever been in U.S. history. And the effect on charity is very profound. When times are tough, money for charities dries up. Okay? Oftentimes, charities rely on donations from wealthy individuals. If the wealthy are just getting by, they're not going to have as much to donate to their favorite charities. So charity funds are limited, and reformers have to make some changes, make some concessions. They used to try to really change people, but people were reluctant to ask for help. Social workers are going to emerge as a new type of profession after the Panic of 1893. They are not just there to aid the poor and the needy. They have an expanded goal. They want to study the causes of the conditions of poverty, of hunger, of crime, and they want to try to understand and then eliminate those causes. So social workers, as a professional occupation, begin collecting data on income, collecting data on housing, collecting data on the types of jobs that the people that are in need actually work, because many of the people in need are the working poor. Okay, these aren't just unemployed people. Social workers collect data on health and the habits of the poor. They're really sociologists. Some of the famous writers that are involved in this movement include Walter Wyckoff, who posed as a working class individual, became a laborer. So he basically does kind of like the undercover boss thing, but he's not a boss. He's a researcher. And as a laborer in a variety of fields, he collected firsthand data and information on what life was like for the working class. For African Americans' experience, The Souls of Black Folk, written by W.E.B. Du Bois, who we're going to hear a lot about in later lessons, that book opens the eyes of what life was like for African Americans. Many white readers learn about the African American experience, or learn more about the African American experience from W.E.B. Du Bois than they ever had known before. Lillian Pettengill looked at the lives of domestic servants, so people who worked as servants. She especially looked at women in those professions and maids. Helen Campbell did research and collected data on female factory workers and women in the workforce in general. And in 1900, many of these reformers come together and form their first organization, the National Civic Foundation, with the goal of really reforming urban life. That sudden growth of urban life had created problems. It's these people that are quick to notice those problems and try to draw attention to the problems and call for something to be done about those problems. In Unit 7, we'll talk about what is done.